Everything we do, every thought we've ever had is produced by the human brain. But exactly how it operates remains one of the biggest unsolved mysteries. And it seems the more we probe its secret, the more surprises we find. Neil deGrasse Tyson. The loud noise from the vent was driving the man crazy. The vent made a zzz whir sound. It was really loud and annoying. The man sighed and fixed the one lock of hair that had slipped out from under his baseball cap. He looked at the vent, thinking about how old and broken it was. Did he also need a change in his life? He felt old and useless, just like the vent. He stared at the screens, but all he saw was static. He wondered if it would be okay to rest his head for a bit. He worked the night shift, and it was very hard and lonely. His eyelids felt very heavy, and he couldn't keep them open. He was very tired. Sleep was an old enemy, always making him feel heavy and slow. He was used to being awake, with his thoughts clear and active, but now everything was quiet, and he felt like he was wrapped in a warm blanket, making him feel even more sleepy. When he opened his eyes, he found himself outside, sitting among old trees that reached up to the stars, covered in a thin fog. In front of him was a wooden cabin, standing alone and peaceful. The moonlight made everything look magical, and he remembered many old memories. He remembered the smell of burning wood, distant laughter, and wild stories. It felt like the memories were waiting for him in the cold air. As he fell asleep, he felt the pull of the quiet woods, and his last conscious thoughts were lost among the rustling leaves. He turned to look into the cold woods. The white spruce trees looked beautiful in the snow. He saw a woman standing behind a tree in the distance, and her presence made him stop. Suddenly, he was back in the office, but he felt strange. He tried to move his fingers, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed. He felt a wave of panic. He felt chills run down his spine as he felt a hand on him. He heard a creepy voice say, "Mark, honey, it's okay. Mommy won't hurt you again." The voice was rough, like the person had been smoking. He knew the voice, but it wasn't his mother. He knew it wasn't a person. His father had died before he was born, and his mother had lost custody of him before she committed suicide. He didn't know his parents, and his mind knew that. Suddenly, his co-worker Jase came into the office, and the sound of the door opening pulled Mark back to reality. He sat up straight, feeling shaken. He told himself it wasn't real. Jase said, "Really, Mark? Sleeping on the job again? Come on, man. What if I was an intruder?" He was serious, but he also chuckled. Mark felt okay now that his friend was there. Jase was his only friend. Mark said, well, yeah. I've just been out of it since Vanessa and I broke up, you know. It feels like the world suddenly just stopped, and now I have to fight to focus or sleep." Jase understood and said, "Oh, I totally understand, man. You need to get that girl off your mind. Truthfully, I never liked her. It always felt like she was judging me." Mark gave him a look, and Jase changed the subject. He said, "Well, anyway, I'm sorry. Tonight, Jack and his brother are having a party. You want to go?" Mark thought it was strange, since Jase and Jack had fought last time they were together. Mark replied, "Do I want to go meet clueless women and do Molly? Nah, I think I'm good on that one, Chief." He was being sarcastic because he was feeling irritable. He started biting his nails, a bad habit he had. Jase said, "You know I wouldn't go to a party where drugs are being peddled around. This one is more chill. You should get out of the house, man." Mark knew Jase was trying to help, but something felt wrong about the offer. Mark said, "All right, just shut up about it. I'll think about going for a few minutes, okay?" Jase knew Mark would consider his offer. The next hour went by quickly. They sat in the office watching the camera feeds and checking the building. They worked as security at a pharmaceutical company. Mark wondered how someone like Jase ended up working with him. Jase was tall, strong, had long black dreads with blonde tips, and a slight Jamaican accent. Mark knew why he was there. He didn't sleep well, so he worked the night shift. Mark was slim and not as strong as Jase. He didn't look intimidating. Mark saw Jase playing with the zipper on his security jacket. Jase noticed a van in the parking lot. He said, "Yo man, this van has been parked in the parking lot for like half an hour. It isn't one of ours, is it?" Mark looked at the feed and said, I don't think so. Maybe we should go check it out." Jase turned and headed for the office door. Mark felt unsure and said, "Wait, I don't know. Are you sure we should go out there?" He didn't like confrontation, but Jase didn't care. Jase said, "Well, there's an unmarked van suspiciously sitting in the parking lot. They don't have a license plate. Let me think about it. Let's go, Mark. He was very assertive. Mark and Jase left the office together. Mark stood next to Jase to show that they were both in charge. They went through the west wing door and approached the van. They heard loud music coming from it, shaking the rusted metal. At first, they thought the music was from a nearby house party. Jase knocked on the tinted window of the van. He shouted, "Excuse me, roll the window down, please." The music stopped, and the window rolled down. Cigarette smoke came out of the van, and a pale face appeared. The man said, "Why, hello there, gentlemen. Didn't mean to bother anyone. Thought I was alone." His voice made Mark feel uneasy. Jase pointed to the pharmacy and said, "You see that building over there? We work here. This is private property, and you can't just park here and play loud music." The man's cold eyes moved to Mark, making him feel chills. The man looked him up and down and let out a chuckle as if he found something funny. "Well, that's my bad. I can leave. I wasn't doing anything important, just taking a minute, you know." Mark looked at Jase, who seemed uneasy but not nervous. He was alert, and Mark wondered why. Jase asked, "Your van is missing plates. Why's that?" His tone was sharp. The man said, They just expired. I already had a cop try to pull me over about it and got a ticket." Jase interrupted him. He felt something was off with the man. "Maybe I should call the cops, get a search warrant for the van, and another ticket for the plates. Or we can all just carry on with our night." Jase made it clear they weren't there to chat, which seemed to be what the man thought. "Right," the man grumbled. His tone and mood shifted. Without another word, he rolled up the window, turned the music back on loudly, and sped out of the parking lot. Jesus, what an asshole and a creep. Something was off about that guy, right? Jase turned to Mark, waiting for him to agree. But Mark stood still, staring at the spot where the man had been. The way he looked at me, it was like a lion looking at its prey. I couldn't breathe. The whole night felt like a weird premonition. Mark had a terrible feeling. Mark sat back in the office chair, waiting for Jase to finish checking the property. He thought about the woods, the woman, and the man. Were they connected? His mind kept thinking and thinking until he drifted off to sleep, his muscles relaxing as he lay back in the chair. Now he was back in the woods, standing in front of a hut. The trees glittered, and their fragrance filled the air. His senses were overwhelmed. He was really there. Mark stepped forward, hearing the crunch of snow beneath his boots. He peeked into the tent and saw something he couldn't understand. A woman was sitting calmly with her legs crossed and hands folded. Mark recognized her dark skin. She was beautiful, with smooth skin that looked like it had no pores. But what stood out most was her long, black, silky hair. Her face had no features, and suddenly Mark knew it was his mother, bits and pieces of her. He had only one faded photo of her from his childhood. Across from her sat Vanessa and Jase. What the hell? What the hell is this? Mark was so deep in thought he forgot this was a dream. "Mom, is that you?" Vanessa spoke. "Oh, Mark, we'll be together again soon. Don't worry, all of us will." Mark's eyes widened. When his mind mimicked loved ones, there were features he used to know they weren't real, but her voice sounded so real. "What is that supposed to—" "Mark!" Jase stood up from the dinner table. "Wake up!" "What?" Mark shouted, frightened. "Wake up, Mark!" Mark shot up from the desk, turning to meet Jase's eyes. "You all right, dude? You were shaking and you looked all sweaty." Jase chuckled. Yeah, man, I'm fine." "I'm not fine," Mark thought immediately. There was a pause. Jase took it as a sign to move on. "You want to check out that party, even just for a little bit?" Mark sighed. He didn't want to go, but he knew Jase was worried about him. "Sure, let's go." They left the building. Mark didn't drive to work, so he got into Jase's yellow 1997 Ford Ranger. It was an old car, but Mark liked the way it looked. There was a feeling, almost awkward, but not quite, as they drove. "Hey, Mark, you were mumbling something about your mum earlier. You seemed pretty shaken up. What's going on? You're barely sleeping, nodding off at work." Jase's voice was full of concern. "I'm okay. You know, I was just thinking I've never really told you about my parents, huh?" "Your parents?" Jase's tone shifted from concern to curiosity. "Yeah, my father passed away before I was born. I was born in Canada, but didn't stay long. I have a few memories, but it's getting harder to remember. I can't even picture my mother anymore. They took me away from her, so I mostly remember growing up in homes." "You've never mentioned this before. Why bring it up now? Not something I love to talk about, but you're my best friend, and I want you to know me. Mark's stomach twisted. So, they took me away from my mom. I think she was abusing drugs, coping with my dad's death. She also got diagnosed with schizophrenia. CPS found out, and next thing I knew, I was in homes where I was beaten and reminded of my faults. My mother may have made mistakes, but she understood my problems. Everyone else struggled to help me. Jase didn't say anything for a minute. The words sank in. The silence felt long until Jase said, "I'm sorry, man. I really am. How could they just take you away from your mother?" My mother was ill, diagnosed with schizophrenia. They tried diagnosing me with it when I was a kid, but it didn't work. I was too young. But I have been diagnosed with brief psychotic disorder and sleep paralysis. It's hard to live with, and sometimes I see my mum, Jase. Jase glanced at Mark while driving. My mother lives the Rastafarian lifestyle. It's a way of life where you grow out your dreads, wear certain clothes, eat certain food. It has many rules. When I moved out, I told her I thought the way she lived was disgusting. I regret that more than anything. I should have embraced it. It's my culture. Instead, I disrespected it, and I will never forgive myself for that. Mark, we all make mistakes. And you're a victim. The sincerity in his tone shook Mark. He felt a new sense of companionship with his friend. Wow, why don't you start now? Feel too ashamed, I suppose. Maybe someday, but it has to start with my mom. I deserve that, and so does she. My point is, don't let this tear you up. Don't think of yourself as a villain. They let the words sink in. Well, we're here, bud. We won't stay long, I promise. Mark and Jase got out of the car. The cultural difference, yet their agreement stunned him. How could two people from different worlds understand each other so well? He wanted to talk more to Jase, but before he knew it, Jase was gone. Mark found himself stuck in a crowd of people feeling out of place. The shouting and cries mixed into a horrible noise for Mark. He rushed to the bathroom, locked the door, and splashed water on his face. Mark was in the bathroom, feeling like he was losing his mind. He saw his mother sitting on the sink, her hollow face staring at him in the mirror. He was stunned and couldn't breathe. What was happening? Oh, Mark, what are you doing here? My darling little boy would never come to a place like this. How could he? She said. Mom, this isn't real. What in the actual fuck is going on right now? Mark said, laughing maniacally. I really am going insane. Unfortunately, no. I am here, Mark, and I'm here for a reason. It'll all be clear soon, she replied. There was a knock at the bathroom door. Mark put his face in his hands, his breath shaking, his body trembling. Hello, said a voice from the hall. Mark took a moment to breathe. He inhaled sharply and then let it out aggressively. He picked himself up off the floor and opened the door. He was surprised to see the woman who had just broken up with him. Hello, Mark said as he opened the door. The woman's eyes widened. Hey, Mark, I didn't know you'd be here. The pause after she spoke felt like it lasted forever. Right. You broke up with me, ghosted me for 3 months, and all you have to say is you didn't expect me to be here. Figures. He pushed past Vanessa's shoulder, regretting his decision to come here even more. Mark, don't be like that, she slurred. Mark assumed she'd been there for a while and was probably drunk. For some reason, this thought made Mark stop. Before he knew it, he was outside, feet in the pool, beer in hand, and Vanessa sitting across from him. That's what she did to him. That's why he loved her so deeply, still loved her, although he would never admit that even to himself. She had that charm, making any bad situation seem good. Vanessa sighed, looking at Mark with a look he couldn't understand. Please, don't pretend like you don't know why I left. That night was really scary for me, Mark. To see someone I knew to be so gentle become like that. Vanessa, I would never hurt you, you know that, right? Mark, Let's not have a rerun. What happened already happened. The only direction is forward. How have you been? Her tone went from shaky to honest, confirming for Mark that she had lost interest in him. Can't really sleep after, yeah? Other than that, it is what it is, getting through the days. Jesus, way to be a Debbie Downer, Mark. She giggled, and her dimples perked up into a beautiful, genuine smile. Do you actually want to know? Mark asked, and before he even looked at her, she was nodding her head. I haven't been great, Nessie. Everything feels so dim. The dreams have become more vivid. It's like my memories are flooding back, but they're not real, or maybe they are. I'm tearing myself up trying to find out the difference. I swear I can remember my mother singing to me, but I never recalled this memory before. It's just strange, you know. Mark turned to look at Vanessa, who appeared to be sleeping sitting up. Come on, let's get you home. He nudged her, but her eyes didn't open. Nessie. He nudged her again, but still no movement. Nessie! Oh God, what did you do? Jasse! Jasse! Mark pleaded and cried, begging his friend to help. Jasse ran out of the house, seeing Mark on the floor, hovering over Vanessa's body. What the hell happened, Mark? Mark's shaky hands reached for her throat to find a pulse. I don't know. She must have taken something. I can barely feel her heartbeat. We have to get to a hospital right now. Jasse handed over his keys to Mark, who then grasped Vanessa's wrists. Jasse grabbed her ankles. They hoisted her up and carried her to Jasse's truck, setting her in the back seat. On the way to the hospital, Mark wondered what would have happened if he hadn't been there. What would have happened to Vanessa? He didn't want to know. He turned on the radio to drown out the constant thoughts in his head. A news report came on. Woman missing. Description is as follows. Age 23, blonde hair, last seen wearing white sweatpants and an orange cut-off sweatshirt. Please contact authorities if you see anyone matching this description. It wasn't completely unusual to hear about someone going missing in the area, but it also wasn't common, especially for an adult. They reached the hospital, and Mark was thankful. Whether he had been speeding the whole time or not, he wasn't sure and didn't care. Mark picked up Vanessa, and Jasse followed. A woman sitting outside the hospital on a bench, smoking a cigarette, noticed them. Mark assumed she was a nurse because she was wearing scrubs. Without any words, the next thing they saw was Vanessa being taken away on a stretcher. Mark sat outside the hospital, his face in his hands, his breath shaking again. Usually he would internalize this awful feeling, but Mark knew this wasn't his fault. He worried about Vanessa, but the thought crossed his mind. Would she want me to worry about her? Mark was feeling lost and confused. A nurse, or maybe a doctor, asked, You, need a cigarette? He responded, A little ironic, don't you think? Aren't you supposed to tell me how awful cigarettes are, doctor? She laughed softly. Nurse, you can call me Amy, though. Your girlfriend is going to be all right. She needs her stomach pumped and then some observation. After that, she's good to go. Mark sighed with relief. Good, that's good. She's my ex-girlfriend, by the way. Amy replied, Ah, my bad. I didn't mean to assume. What about that other man? Mark explained. Co-worker. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but why are you out here talking to me? Amy laughed again, louder this time, making Mark feel like he was being teased, but he didn't mind. I just thought you looked like someone who needed another someone to talk to. Mark appreciated her kindness. Well, I appreciate that, Amy. Most people wouldn't take the time to do a decent thing like that. Amy smiled sweetly. I guess I'm not most people. She crushed her cigarette and walked back into the building. Mark felt a wave of loneliness. He leaned back and looked at the sky. The clouds formed interesting shapes, like a camel and a flower growing in an empty meadow. Soon, Mark drifted off to sleep, but this time his dreams were different and worse. In his dream, a woman with smeared bright red lipstick and overcurled eyelashes exclaimed, God damn it, what was his name? Mark. She and a man with slicked back black hair were angry because Mark had wet the bed. They didn't expect him to be such a burden. The woman dragged young Mark out of bed and put him in a corner. Anything to say for yourself, brat? She asked. Young Mark nervously replied, I was just scared. He stood in the corner with his eyes shut tight. Suddenly, a voice changed from a man's to a child's, accusing him. It was all your fault, Mark. When Mark opened his eyes, he was back in the cold, snowy woods. People pointed at him and laughed in a demonic harmony, and then there was silence. Someone asked him, Mark, do you feel safe in your home? Are there times you feel scared or nervous? Mark found himself back in front of the hospital, but he couldn't see anything. It felt like he was in a blank world until he heard a distorted, familiar voice saying, Oh, poor thing. Don't forget you tore yourself away from us. It was you. It was all your fault. Mark gasped and woke up, struggling to breathe. A few tears escaped his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away and went back into the hospital. It all felt like a distorted reflection of reality. Amy came back outside and sat down next to Mark. He realized he didn't know where Jasse was, probably off charming some other nurse. Amy asked, What happened tonight? She handed Mark a cigarette from her pack. I honestly don't know. We showed up to a party and Vanessa was there. We talked, and the next thing I knew I was speeding to the hospital. Amy smiled and lit his cigarette. Mark wasn't much of a smoker, but tonight he accepted it. It looks like she either got laced or took pills while drinking, Amy said. Mark firmly stated, she was laced. She's not the type to do something stupid. Amy chuckled. Nice to meet you, Mark, but you don't need to force anything with me. I get it. This world is shitty sometimes, and you're having a shitty night. For that, I am sorry. Her words felt like a warm hug. Thanks. Funny enough, that means a lot. Amy gently squeezed Mark's shoulder and said, get some sleep. Come back in the morning. Mark nodded, took the last drag of the cigarette, and waved goodbye. He didn't want to sour the interaction, as it was one of the most reassuring conversations he'd had. As Mark got back in his truck, he realized there would be no sleep tonight. He had to go back to work, and noticed Jose still wasn't around. He called him, but there was no answer. Unsure of what else to do, Mark leaned his head back in the seat, his neck cracking gently. When was the last time I worked out? Mark wondered. When was the last time I even stretched? He looked out the window at the tall pine trees and inhaled the sweet aroma of nature. He slipped into sleep. This time he stayed in the truck. He wasn't taken to his old house or a foster home. He felt something eating away at him. He lifted his head and saw the faceless woman again. Mark felt small. Why won't you just leave me alone? He asked. The woman giggled softly. Leave you? You mean like you left me? No, Mark. Never. I'm here for you. Don't you understand? I want to help you. They stole you away from me. But it's coming. Just like I said it would. Mark felt his muscles tighten, his arm hairs standing up. Mom, stop this, please, you're gone. The faceless woman tilted her head, her blank expression giving Mark an eerie feeling. Oh, honey, I never left. She slowly brought her hands up to Mark's chest, gently placing her palms on his shirt. Suddenly, he felt a heavy impact and found himself falling out of the vehicle. He noticed there was no second impact. He was just falling. Sometimes he fell fast, sometimes slow, and sometimes it felt like he was suspended in air, space, and time. Mark began to scream violently, and with that, he jolted forward, finding himself back in the vehicle. He slammed his head forward so fast that it hit the dashboard with immense force. He felt a little blood trickle from the top of his nose down his cheek and into his mouth. The blood tasted bitter, like copper, but at least it reminded him this was real, and he was okay. Jesus Christ, Mark! Jose yelled from the driver's seat. They were driving and almost back to the building where they worked. Dude, I think you broke your nose. Mark bunched up his shirt in his hand and gently tapped it against the gash on his nose. Even the gentle taps hurt. I'm sorry, Jose. I was having a night terror. I think driving made it worse. So it's my fault, Jose said with a slightly agitated tone. He was trying to be a good friend but could only deal with so much in one night. No. Tonight has just been, I don't know, eventful. Mark rubbed the remaining blood off his face. His nose was still sore and swelling. Jose let out an exasperated sigh. I get it, man. It's been a long night. I'm sorry. I really didn't know Vanessa would be there. We don't have to talk about it. Mark snapped back immediately. I'm just glad she's safe. Mark, you never told me what happened between you guys. It seems pretty serious. Jose, I said... Mark stopped himself. It dawned on him that he hadn't told anyone what happened with Vanessa. No, you're right, Jay. I need to talk about this. Jose didn't say anything, just waited patiently for Mark to talk. As Mark gathered his words, Jose remained silent. Vanessa and I broke up about a month ago. We were... Mark sighed painfully, quivering as the memories came back. It was the first time I had a sleep paralysis episode in a long time. It was really bad, like really bad. I freaked out. When I woke up, I thought I was having a schizophrenic episode. I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. I went into a psychosis. I thought... Mark began to choke on his words, tears streaming down his face as the memories jabbed at his brain. I thought she was going to hurt me, and I hurt her. When I came to, we were in opposite corners of the room. Cuts and bruises, Mark choked on his words. They were too hard to swallow. I'm an awful person, Jose. As Mark began to cry, he folded his hands over his face to hide his shame, to hide the monster he thought he was. Damn, Mark. I don't even... Jasse looked over at Mark and saw his friend in pain. Jasse pulled the truck over and placed his hand gently on Mark's shoulder. Listen, what you did was messed up. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But it also wasn't your fault. You're not an abuser, Mark. You're a damaged person. I'm sorry for you and Vanessa. Shit happens, man, but you're a good person. You know that, don't you? Mark didn't know what to think of himself now that the question had been posed. Is he a good person? Can good people do bad things and still be good people? Mark. Jasse felt the silence for too long. It became a burden. Yeah, you're right. Mark had no idea what to say. It felt like a worm was eating his stomach and getting ready to burst through his chest. Both men hopped out of the truck after Jasse parked. They didn't exchange words. There was simply an understanding in the air. Tonight had gone horribly. Mark threw on his black jacket with a patch that said security. The patch had a lazy sewing job, so it hung off the jacket slightly. Jasse did the same. As they sat down, he turned to Mark. Look, it's been a long night. I'll go run rounds on the west wing of the property, catch some sleep, and you can run your rounds on the east when I get back. Don't talk back. Let's just get tonight's shift done, together. Jasse walked off to begin his rounds. Mark sat there for a moment, silence enveloping him. He was scared to sleep, to even drift off. But like Jasse said, tonight had been a long night, and sleep was inevitable. Mark found himself in the middle of the ocean. He expected a storm, a tidal wave to sweep him away. But it was beautiful. The sun beamed warmth onto Mark's skin. The ocean breeze smelled sweet but salty. He couldn't help but relax. A voice came out of nowhere, the same voice that's always there. Mark, do you remember our day at the beach? You and your cousin had so much fun. I'd never seen you so happy. The next day your father died. I never saw that happy boy again. These words pierced through his heart. He never thought about that day, or the day after. How could he? He was so young. It was so painful. I needed you after that, and you abandoned me. Yeah, well, I needed you too, kid. You're the one who... You could have lived. You could have gotten better and fought for me. He didn't notice it, but tears streamed down his face. I was broken, Mark. I never ever meant to hurt you. You know that, right? The faceless woman Mark so desperately wished he could recognize gently hugged him. He could feel her presence, but not her touch. Yeah, me too. Jasse walked around the west wing of the pharmaceutical building. He knew there wouldn't be anyone breaking in, but he also knew he had to do his job. He peeked through the windows on doors, shined his flashlight through the hollow hallways. I wonder if Mark is sleeping. I wonder if that's a good thing. Jasse felt concern for his friend. He thought back to when they met. Jar was about 16 years old. Mark was maybe 14. It was the infamous neighborhood of Compton, California. Jasse was walking home when he saw a scrawny white kid being beat on by two older boys. Jasse barreled towards the boy immediately. Hey, get the fuck off him! Young Jasse pleaded out. He was trying to sound tough, but it didn't work. Oh yeah? Or what? You think you can do something about it? The older kids dropped the bloodied smaller child. Run! He shouted as he started his own altercation with the bullies. Jasse felt every punch slam into his face, his ribs, his stomach. He was on the verge of bawling and puking when the smaller kid tackled one of the older boys. They all fought until sundown, when the older kids finally gave up and went home. The two younger children, battered and bruised, exchanged a look of mutual pain and understanding of that pain. Tears fell down their faces onto the grass stained red from their blood. With that they laughed and walked each other home. Jasse looked back on that moment fondly. It was a sad moment, but a great memory. The day he met Mark, that scrawny white kid couldn't fight for shit, but neither could Jasse. When he returned to the office, Mark was already awake. He was quiet. The rest of the night went on without any other events. Mark did his rounds. They watched over the security cameras, and both caught a little more shut-eye. Looking back now, they wish they knew that would be one of their few last chances to sleep. Story 2. There is no way to pace this story, because my recollection of the event is like any other truly violent one, chaotic and instantaneous. None of life's tragic moments are long build-ups to skillfully told releases. They are disorientatingly fleeting, only properly understood with hindsight. But I think the retelling is important. if only to remember what happened. I am an electrician with an engineering degree. My father had a passion for boats, and so naturally I spent some time in the Navy. Although I learned much, it is only important insofar as telling you that I was very qualified for my job. I worked on a cargo ship. That work was a very lonely existence. Hard to keep on to people when you are offshore for long stretches of time, especially women. I had a high school sweetheart, and I spent time dating after we broke up. But no one could stomach my profession, and having me in exile so consistently. So I make do with my own company. Sure, when you are at sea, you make friends for life. No way you can't under those circumstances. The thing is just that most of these friends for life, you won't ever see again. Everyone takes jobs when they can, and that means spending a lot of time on the same ship with different men. The men with families plan their schedules around those families, staying true to what's important to them, and therefore often fly home when we port. It is different when you are a single man. Work can become an escape from your life. It can keep your mind off the things you really need, keep you from improving, from finding solutions, making changes. It can occupy your mind, even if that mind hungers desperately for change, seeking anything but that horrible doomed loneliness at sea. Still, the work makes you stay. It takes away the energy you need to wonder and find better things. The work that consumed my time on the waters was relatively simple. I did maintenance, specifically for the stuff that had to work. Lights, sensors, engine control, and so on. Anything where you would think an electrical signal resulted in the mechanical change of a system. I was the man you talked to. That made days simple. I had one tool that was always with me, a voltmeter. Wondering if current is passing through this wire. Simple as connecting to it and you will know. Making my rounds around the ship this way, checking this and that. I was constantly running into the entire crew. We all knew each other well after no time at all. But from the perspective of others, I get why I was always greeted with surprise. I knew where they were stationed, but they knew little of my rounds, or didn't care to. "Hey Jim, finding it hard to stay away from me?" It was Mark. Basically the only part of the crew I knew from earlier. He was such a lovely man, kind-hearted, helpful, understanding and full of playful humor. "Of course, you're magnetic." I held up my voltmeter like it was dragging me to him. He gave out a small snicker. What's wrong with our ship today?" No one liked Justin. Not sure why. Maybe it was because he forced himself into stuff people weren't interested in sharing with him, or maybe it was just me. And I despised the fact he didn't understand I wasn't interested in having mine and Mark's friendly jestabouts interposed with generic small talk. I had a fleeting thought occur to me then, of replying, "You are the problem with our ship," but kept it to myself. "So, as usual, it's just loose signals that are being tightened up, but you should be glad I'm not letting anyone in on how shitty our sonar is." All ships have a sonar that helps measure the depth to the seafloor. It isn't really useful when you're at the middle of the ocean, like we were at this time, but it can be extraordinarily important when close to shore. And if you are like most normal people, you probably haven't thought about how a sound-based system knows what is underneath you and what is at the sides of you. After all, it is a wave that just propagates out to all sides, so how would you know what the echo was bounced off? The reason why it works is answered by how it sounds. Multiple wavelengths of sound are emitted at once. The waves flow over each other, creating interference. The image is then created by how these waves have changed when they come back. The waves spread out in 3D, and when the sound is bounced of an object, all of the components with different wavelengths are shifted in relation to each other. Where there once was negative interference, there is now positive, and maybe vice versa, allowing you with some math to know what direction the return signal is coming from. Interference like this is crazy complicated. When interference is between two waves in head-on collision, it is relatively easy to understand. But when waves can spread between each other in 3Ds, or even 2D surfaces like an ocean, it immediately becomes very hard to grasp how they interact. But this complicated interaction is why sonar works, and simultaneously why ours wasn't always able to. Because in some cases, different wavelengths interact in such an unfortunate manner as to create spots of hyper-enlarged magnitudes. Basically, a single spot can be placed in a location where all waves peak together, right at that same intersection spot, creating a wave of such intensity that it can fry the system, simply by being literal hundreds of times bigger than the equipment was ever designed to withstand. A rogue wave, as it is called. And it just so happens that our sonar has a tendency to create such waves much more frequently than you would expect. Let me guess. It's so bad as to basically be like going in blind. I didn't answer Justin this time. Just looked at Mark as I went by them onto the next task. Don't have too much fun without me now. I didn't pity Mark having to stay with Justin. That evening we were all called in to eat together, which was a rare event. The captain chose to give us some bad news in a nice setting. Not that the room was nice, just that company was. Imagine a ship, and you will know what it looked like. Cramped. Iron walls spray-painted with a thick layer of whitish paint, fluorescent lights, tables mounted to the floor. The feeling was like you had chosen to live with 15 other men in a floating prison. What a brutal profession. So we are about a couple of days, a day or two out from really bad winds. We all knew what that meant, even if his look hadn't been so stern. Our captain was a man with many, many years of expertise. That he even called a meeting meant this was critical information, and getting a wind warning out on sea didn't mean strong winds, it meant waves. And of course that means dangerous waters. The weight of his words draped over us like a duvet. Just like any slumber party, anything outside of it became a distant reality. I broke the silence. How tall are we expecting them? The captain turned his eyes to meet mine. The important thing is that we prepare for it. That's the only focus at this point. Everybody on board with that assessment? He turned his gaze towards the room. He didn't know the answer, which was frightening. Sounds good, Cap, a few of the men said uncoordinatedly, allowing his desperate plea to let his ignorance slip under the rug. So, that night I dreamt terrible things. I dreamt that all of us was in the lifeboat. The ship slowly taking on water. We had managed to make an escape, but the lifeboat wouldn't unlatch. With such a technical fault, I dreamt of the men arguing, to some degree violently. They were choosing a crew member to unlatch it from the outside, staying back with the cargo on the doomed vessel, and logically, at least to my dreaming mind, they chose me. I was the only one that knew how to operate the latching mechanism, and being forced to step out from the security of the lifeboat, I watched Mark fight back against the group consensus. Landing backwards on the through metal of the cargo ship, I watched the men that threw me give way to an enormous version of Mark's head filling the entire doorway with his big, teary eyes. As the ship started listing, I got to my feet, a new directive being installed into my being. Survival was no longer an option. Only the ability to save my tribe remained, saving Mark. Dreams are weird conglomerations of ideas, and I don't know if we hugged, but we definitely exchanged a deep-felt goodbye. And I grabbed the small pin, keeping me from ridding the boats of shackles. Pushing it of the ship, I watched as I was ripped from existence by my own heroism. You slept okay, Jim? Mark handed me a much-needed coffee. Even if I had slept well, I wouldn't have been able to make coffee in this sea. Contrary to common belief, a ship doesn't sway every which way. The ship is most well-equipped going straight onto the waves. The captain going in head-on to the waves meant you could be pretty sure what ways you would be thrown, although the sea wasn't bad enough to throw us yet, but you could feel the winds the captain had promised had worse in store for us when we reached them. I accepted the coffee graciously. Thank you. A small smile towards him was unwillingly given off my lips. Well, I actually slept quite poorly. I directed my following inquiry to the entire room. Does anyone here know how to keep the lifeboat clamps engaged? The question was vague. I designed it that way, such that it would only get a reply from someone I could trust with the task. Yes, sure, why? Anything wrong with the controls? This was my guy, a man named Joshua. No, not necessarily. I just haven't gotten around to check the circuitry is all. I need a hand with keeping the boat on tight whilst I'm in there. You have time? Mark let off a smirk. He muttered whilst bringing back my attention to him. Sure. Holler when you need me. After Joshua's affirmation, I returned to Mark with a disapproving look. Grab a jacket, Joshua. It's getting cramped in here. Mark's smirk disappeared. Making our way outside wasn't as bad as I had expected, yet not easy. The waves at this point being no more than an omen of the storm to come. Only the swinging oceanic vibrations, manifesting in the waves we now felt, had been able to travel far enough to reach us. The problem was that the seemingly random intervals between the waves made it hard to discern a pattern to the swaying they created. When walking, you ended up having little indication of when they would hit, and looking out over the water, the only regularity I could discern to their motion was their direction. The lifeboat hung at a 45-degree angle of the side of the ship. It was orange, and it was very awkward to get into. I stepped up next to it with Joshua. Know what to do? Yes, sir, Joshua answered sarcastically. I waited for another response. He didn't get the hint. Yes, sir, he repeated, now with obedience. And what are you doing? He had a look of embarrassment on his face, as he understood what I had meant all along. I'll be standing here holding onto the release, stopping the pin from disengaging. I nodded. Great, thank you, Joshua. With our roles defined, I moved into the small canister. Taking a hand to the top of the door, I put my foot onto the sloped floor. What a terrible design choice this was. Ducking into it, I used one hand to grab seats on the way down to the control panel, the other hand tightly gripping my trusty voltmeter. Each step into the maw of it, my movement became more and more fluid, whilst my anxiety in turn grew worse and worse. As I came closer to its control panel, I could see more and more ocean through the tiny enforced windows. The waves were scattered across the ocean. Like an ill-commanded army, their power was laughable. Given proper coordination, they would have been capable of much greater feats than putting us off balance. I sat myself in the captain's chair of the small tin. Joshua, you there? I spoke with more nervousness than I thought I would. I wasn't afraid of falling into the water. I was afraid the boat would fall into the water. Sure, I could get back on the ship, but the boat, our only safety, would be lost forever. Yes, I'm here, holding the release pin. You are clear. I popped the control panel. I looked for the wire that connected to the release button. It was in a cluster of wires that went to the door. This system had plenty of redundancy, which was good and unexpected, honestly. Looks like my nightmare was unsubstantiated, but not checking the signal now would be silly. I placed my voltmeter on my lap and removed one of the measuring clamps. Slowly I extended my hand and put the clamp to just one of the release wires. Once in place, I retracted my hand and went for the next clamp on the device. Reaching forward, I put the other clamp on the same wire, completing the circuit. Pressing release, I warned Joshua. You are clear, Joshua replied. I pressed the button. It lit up green. My voltmeter spiked. The mechanism worked. There was no movement. Relief. Okay, yeah, I felt it kick. What a kick, it works all right. The powerful joy in his last affirmation was exactly what I needed. Perfect. Thank you, Joshua. I'm packing up in here. You can relax again. Leaning down, I went to take away one of the clamps, but Joshua interrupted me. Oh my God, Jim Jime. I looked out the small window in front of me. The ocean was full of smaller yet dangerous waves traveling incoherently, but a pattern had emerged from their movement, and one peak had formed to such enormous mass that it began towering over the ship. We were going to get hit, and the ship would not be able to handle it. I went into shock. Everything slowed down. Watching that wave grow, every gut-wrenching moment vividly detailed. First was the rain. The wind blew of the water from it and showered the ship. This is when I remember the horn sounding, a useless attempt at a warning. The next I remember was feeling our enormous cargo ship being lifted out of the water with a dizzying speed and ease, the rogue wave rolling us over. I felt my body being accelerated by gravity with my back first into the seat, a direction I hadn't expected gravity to pull. Looking back towards Joshua, I hoped he had made it into the lifeboat with me, only to see him being swept of his feet plummeting toward a background of blue that I couldn't determine if was ocean or sky. Being snapped out of my catatonic state, I hammered my hand into the release button on the console. The next thing was the impact. First, I heard the sound of waves impact the cargo ship. It sounded like someone had pitch-shifted the crumbling of an aluminum can. The sheer brutality of the sound, a dire reminder of the frailty of steel. Then the lifeboat was sent to the heavens. This boat, which was designed to plummet into waters from great heights, was dented by the force. I dare not imagine what had happened if the wave had collided with it in any other manner than head-on. I was thrown out of my seat and only barely saved my head from colliding with the inside of the lifeboat by sacrificing an arm, the wrist of which was pulverized. The halfway point of the arm, having bones rushing out the skin in feeble attempt to escape the rest of the massacre. Landing on the floor, I felt the lifeboat accelerate upwards. Emerging from the water's eye, and it was sent airborne again. When it hit the water, I came crashing to a halt on the floor. Abusing the adrenaline to ignore the pain, I scurried to get on my feet. I looked out the window for any signs of life. By some miracle, I found it. A tiny speck of man was in the waters not that far from me. It was Joshua, but the wave had already claimed him. The impact of the water had mauled him worse than a big rig ever could. There was blood all around him, and I could only see one of his arms flailing in an attempt to help himself afloat. His movements looked like the spasms executed by a mechanical doll, pre-programmed and soulless. If he wasn't already following God's light, the only humane thing was to let him. The ship was gone. Only white foam on water and shifting waves remained on the sea, and as if someone had put the water underneath the vessel to a boil, air bubbles from the ship were rushing to the surface. The sheer volume of air, the enormous exhalation from the cavities of the sinking iron lung that I had called home, and that now others would find their grave. The thought that this air meant that Mark could be trapped in there, still being in panic and falsely clinging onto hope, deep beneath the ocean. The thought filled me with terror. I was watching a scene of complete erasure, no evidence left behind of the carnage that had taken so much from so many, and as a devilish answer to my newfound despair, evidence was brought back from the deep. Crates of cargo started erupting up from the water. Like floats that had been submerged, their buoyancy lifted the crates so violently that they became airborne, careening out of the water, soaring into the skies. Their re-entry into the waters defaced them to lichen accordions by the force of it. As much as I could have risked searching for survivors, seeing 20-foot crates, tons of steel shot from the ocean, only to come hailing down again, I had to get away. Days later, I was picked up as the only survivor. Many ships go down like this every year. Rogue waves are not a myth. They do happen, and you just have to pray that it won't be close to you. Story 3. Do you want to know the truth? My boyfriend Seth has, or had I should say, been in my life since I was 14 years old. I remember it very vividly because the same night that he and his family moved into town, my stepfather, well, he did something awful to me, and that was the start of 2 years of even worse hell than my previous 14 years had been. That awful night, after my stepfather left the room, I gazed out of my bedroom window, tears rolling down my cheeks. I was frightened and alone. That's when I saw Seth for the first time. He must have just moved into the large house opposite, the posh, detached 3-story house. He was in the bedroom that was directly across from mine. His dad was in there with him, his arm thrown around his shoulders, pointing around at the bare walls, probably chatting about how to make it their own. I watched his mum enter the room with a tray of mugs, probably hot chocolate, I remember thinking, my mouth watering and my stomach grumbling. Seth was there in the middle of his family, the center of their universe, and I was mesmerized by him. He had messy black hair and a mischievous grin, and I could see his parents laughing, so I just knew he was funny. They were an attractive family, the sort you see in stock photos but without the dead eyes. Their eyes were full of love. I desperately wanted to be friends with someone like him, but I didn't believe he would ever want to be friends with the weird kid of the neighborhood. There wasn't anyone who wanted to be friends with me. Seth wasn't just anyone, though. He was very special. On that first proper day of him living there, my mum had tossed me out onto the street to play with the kids who lived on the road, even though she knew they just picked on me. Seth's mum probably encouraged him to get out and make some new friends, while her and his dad unpacked their things, as Chelsea, a girl in my year at school who lived on my street, and her younger cousin who stayed with them regularly, were being horrible to me. I saw him doing kickflips on a skateboard in his front garden. "Rose, why don't you ever brush your hair? You look so ugly." Chelsea sneered at me, her cousin cackling like a hyena. They were right. I did look ugly, and I really did never brush my hair. I think that's what stung the most. You get horrible people in life who do and say awful things to you, but you can take comfort in the fact that that person is just a terrible excuse for a human being. But when you're attacked with the truth, it cuts through you like a knife. The truth can either completely devastate us, or it can give us the strength to rise up. I seem to be constantly devastated by it. After throwing a few more painful insults about my personal appearance, they got bored and wandered off, probably into town to hang around with their mass of friends. Why do the mean kids always have so many friends? As soon as they had gone, Seth wandered over to me. "Hi, I'm Seth. he said, his voice shy, but with a confidence I knew I would never have. "Hello," I responded nervously. I couldn't understand why he was talking to me, and when he sat down on the curb next to me, I flinched, expecting him to do something nasty. Instead, he kicked at a stone lazily at his feet. "Those girls seem pretty awful," he mumbled. I was shocked. I had expected him to ask me to introduce him to Chelsea, because all the lads my age wanted to go out with her, but I could tell from the tone of his voice that he was disgusted by the way they spoke to me, and my heart soared. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mum coming out of the front door. I stood up quickly while she locked up and headed around the corner where I knew she wouldn't see me. I didn't want her yelling at me or telling me to do something. To my surprise, Seth followed me. We stood next to each other silently, both aware I was hiding from my mother. He didn't make fun of the way I stooped when I walked, like so many of the other kids did, like a tortoise trying to hide in its shell, which earned me the nickname Tortoise at school. The truth stung. After 30 seconds, I allowed myself to breathe. I looked up and he was staring at me, smiling kindly. I darted my eyes to the ground. Unable to keep eye contact, he lightly touched my chin, raising my eyes to meet his. "Do you want to watch the X-Files with me?" he asked me gently. "Oh, okay," I stuttered. Sure, it was all a trick. I swallowed noisily, trying to gulp down my insecurities. "Aren't your parents still unpacking, though?" "Yeah, well, we can watch it at yours, right? My parents work from home, so I'm not really allowed friends over." I nodded, smiling now, aware that I looked goofy but unable to hide my grin. Friends? So I led him to my house and showed him how to climb up to the fixture above my front door and then pull up into my bedroom window. I always left it slightly open because my mum and stepdad often locked me out when they were out for hours on end. I was nervous at first, having a boy in my room for the very first time. There was mold all up the walls and I had no sheets on my quilt. My pillows had all funny yellow stains on, and there were holes in my mattress where I had been playing with one of my mum's lighters when I was bored. Seth didn't seem to notice, though, or at least he pretended not to. Either way, he seemed so at ease that it kept me from feeling humiliated. We sat on my bed next to each other, and that became our daily routine over the summer. As soon as my mum went out, we would jump up and watch the X-Files over and over again. I couldn't believe it when, a few weeks in, Seth put his arm around me as we were watching. My stomach did a flip as I nestled into him, I felt, hearing his heart pound in his chest. For the first time in my life, I felt accepted. We fell in love, even though we were so young. I kept him a secret from my parents, because they were truly evil, and I didn't want Seth to have such negative monsters in his life. But his parents knew all about us, and his mum and dad often chatted to me in the street. It didn't matter to him that I had no friends. In fact, it seemed to suit him. He was a huge introvert, probably on the spectrum, and I preferred to keep him all to myself anyway. He was unbelievably gorgeous. His hair always perfect, his clothes always new and so stylish. But he kept himself to himself, so I didn't have to contend with all the girls of the neighborhood trying to tempt him from me. I asked him one day what he saw in me. "You're beautiful. You're clever. You're funny," he said. I grinned at him like the Cheshire Cat, knowing none of that was true, but also believing that he saw me that way. It was the best summer I'd ever had, even though the worst things my stepfather did to me began that year. However, Seth had been the most perfect distraction. Chelsea even moved away, so I didn't have to deal with her and her vile cousin anymore. I heard my parents talking about it one evening. They'd heard she had taken an overdose and barely survived. She had some sort of brain damage. Her family moved swiftly away for a fresh start. I was pleased that I wouldn't have to have her treating me so terribly anymore, but sad that she had had so much bitterness and anger inside her that she'd felt she needed to try and end it. When school started back in September, I found that Seth was home educated. He had a habit of not really telling me huge things about himself unless they were completely relevant. He was more of a listener than a talker. I was glad that he wouldn't have to see me getting bullied every day. Even though home life had become so much more bearable now I had Seth, I knew the school days would be as miserable as before. Sometimes I wished he was there to stand up for me, but every evening as soon as my mum had fallen asleep and my stepdad had left my room, Seth would climb up and into my room and make me feel better. We'd cuddle, watch the X-Files, and sometimes kiss. But even as the years went by, he never, ever pushed me any further. I never told him what my stepfather did, but I think he knew, and he was content with what we had. He just wanted to make me happy. When I was 16, my stepfather died. He slit his wrists in the bathtub. I was out in the woods with Seth at the time, and my mum was working. I felt irrationally guilty about it all afterwards. Maybe if I'd been home, I could have stopped him. Maybe I could have got him some help. "But why would you want to?" Seth had asked. I wasn't sure, so I didn't answer. Losing my stepdad had pushed my already bitter mother over the edge, and she was furious all the time. She drank more and more, and she took it all out on me. After a year, I could no longer cope with it, and so I left home. I was placed in a council flat in a very rough area of town, but even though the neighbors screamed and fought and took drugs in the stairways, at least I was away from home. I saw a light shining somewhere in my future. Seth would come over most nights, and sometimes he would stay with me. Other times he would go home after I had fallen asleep. He was always there when I needed him, and every day I felt myself becoming stronger. He worked for his parents' tech business, mainly remotely. It suited his need for solitude. I worked in a dead-end factory job which was soul-destroying, honestly. I thought I would lose my mind at points, but I had to pay the bills and buy food. I couldn't escape my depression, and before long Seth moved in full-time to try and keep me in bright spirits. His parents didn't pay him well, wanting to teach him some sort of life lesson about privilege, so we always struggled for money, but we had each other, and we were happy. You never really heal from an abusive childhood, but things get easier over the years, and with Seth by my side, things really did improve. When I was in my early 20s, I went to college and got the qualifications I needed to attend university. I struggled at college. I still never fitted in anywhere and had very low self-confidence, but when I started uni, there were so many people there that I was barely noticed. Early on in my first year, Seth had to work in London for a month. I wanted to surprise him when he got back. I threw out my wardrobe of baggy, black clothes that had always rendered me as close to invisible as possible and bought some tight-fitting, bright dresses. I got my hair cut and I allowed myself to stand out. When he got back, he held me for a long time. "I've missed you," he said. "You look beautiful. You know you always do, though, don't you?" I blushed, turning on the X-Files and cuddling into him all evening. I was nervous about my new style getting noticed at uni. I know that seems weird, but the idea of people complimenting the change would make me face the fact that there had been a problem in the first place. However, there were so many people there that they really didn't notice, not directly. Anyway, I did find that people made more of an effort to talk to me. I began to make friends. I was encouraged by my peers to join societies based on my interests. One night at a social event, I met some bloke who was studying art who quite clearly wanted to be more than friends. I couldn't believe it. I told him I had a boyfriend, but would love to be friends. He seemed disappointed that we wouldn't go any further. I was so flattered. When I got the bus home that night, I couldn't stop smiling. I told Seth about it and he laughed. "Of course he tried it on. You're perfect." I graduated, not inviting my mum, who I was estranged from now. Seth was working away more frequently now, and the graduation ceremony coincided with him being in London. When he offered to tell his parents he needed to come home, I promised him that it was fine. I didn't mind. I insisted he stayed there. I was kind of glad to simply share it with my university friends. It seemed like I had created my own safe spot there just for me. Plus, I had an inkling that his parents were setting him up to take over company when they retired. I believed that good times were coming for both of us. As yet more years passed, I climbed up the ladder in my new job that I had practically walked into, with my degree and my newfound confidence. Seth and I did little more than best friends might, but we adored each other with a passion that my proper friends were envious of when I told them about it. He was the perfect boyfriend. However, when a new boss took over my section at work, depression started to cripple me in bouts. He was a misogynistic bully, and he reminded me of my stepdad. Every day I was terrified of being called into his office. When he walked past me, I struggled to breathe. I found myself coping by retreating into my imagination. During those dark times that often lasted weeks, sometimes even months, I have to admit that I pushed Seth away. I would become obsessed with celebrities that I had watched on the television, forming wild crushes on them and creating entire personalities for them, with storylines that centered around them falling in love with me. I would imagine they were there with me, holding me to sleep, falling in love with me, doing everyday things with me, all the things that my wonderful Seth had done for so many years. He was left behind, but I was honest with him. I told him about my imaginary affairs and what was happening at work. He told me they were a coping mechanism, and though they probably weren't healthy, they were a sign of a shift in my mental state. He promised that I shouldn't feel guilty about them. After all, it wasn't real. As my boss started to call me into his office more regularly, openly staring at my breasts and legs, my mental health deteriorated. I retreated further and further into my imaginary relationships, sometimes calling in sick just so I could spend time with my creations. I didn't really see it as dangerous. Well, not until I went to see a comedian perform at the theatre, and I booked 2 tickets, even though I attended alone. I wanted to pretend one of my creations was there with me. I kept turning and laughing at the empty space, pretending he was next to me, falling in love with me a little bit more every time I laughed, because I was giving him an insight into the way my mind worked. As I made my way home, I felt sick with shame. I was allowing my weird game to spill over into my real life. I knew what I had just done was dangerous. I also felt rueful that I felt sexually attracted to these creations, but I had never even been able to sleep with Seth. I fell into bed and sobbed hysterically when I got home. I felt Seth's arm rubbing my back. "Rose, what's wrong?" he asked. But I couldn't speak. I just shook my head frantically. "Please, you can tell me anything," he urged me. "You know that. I just want to help you." I swallowed down the sobs and told him what I had done. I told him how out of hand this was getting. I told him I was scared that I was crazy. "Perhaps you realizing that it's getting out of hand is a good thing, Rose," he said, stroking my hair. "Maybe this is your glass-shattering moment. You know, they say crazy people don't actually know they're crazy, they think they're normal, so you can't be crazy, right?" He had calmed me down and comforted me like he always did. I fell asleep with my arms wrapped around him for a while, listening to his heart beat slowly. My Seth, my savior. I woke up at 3 a.m. with chest pains. Seth held me close, helping me catch my breath. "What's wrong with me?" I gasped. "You're panicking. Rose, it's your mind making your body react this way. You're having a bad reaction from facing the truth. It will get better soon, I promise." It was my first ever panic attack. But looking back now, I guess I was lucky not to have been having them for much longer. And though I trusted Seth, it didn't feel like it was ever going to get better. Night after night in the following weeks, I would fall asleep listening to Seth's heartbeat. Then I would wake up hours later, my chest tight, struggling to breathe, crippled, frozen to the spot. A few weeks after the first, I whispered to him as I recovered, "When is this going to end?" He sighed, "Whenever you want it to, Rose." I went back to sleep. The next night, after yet another panic attack, I lay there exhausted. I shuffled out of his arms and twisted around so I could look at him. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my lip trembling and a lump in my throat. "I can't imagine a world without you in it." Tears filled my eyes, so I looked down. He smiled at me, then he lightly touched my chin, raising my eyes to meet his. My tears spilled out. "The good thing is, Rose, that you don't have to imagine a world without me in it, do you? You just have to step into it. You just need to say goodbye." "How long have you known for?" I asked him, the tears flowing freely now, because I knew this was the end. He was calm. "As long as you have, I suppose. I think that's the way it works, and there's no point in asking me questions about the meaning of it all because you know as much as I do already. Or, I guess I should say, I know as much as you do," he shrugged. "But what's changed? Why now?" I pleaded. Seth gripped me into a bear hug. "You have changed. You're getting better, can't you see? Going to the theatre, realizing what you did was unhealthy, that was just the beginning. It's just been me and you for so long, Rose, since your stepdad." He let the sentence trail off. "I invented you the first night he did it to me," I murmured. "Looks that way, doesn't it?" I felt him kiss me on the head as I pushed my face into his chest, my heart breaking. "Hey, cheer up," he said. "Maybe in a parallel universe, I'm the real one and you're the imaginary friend." I laughed, even though I felt like my insides were being ripped out. "Do you want to watch the X-Files with me?" he asked me gently. I nodded and turned on the television, crying silently all the way through, but safely cuddled into him. I fell asleep listening to his heart beating, slower than before. I supposed it had been getting slower every night, these last weeks. I just hadn't wanted to accept it. When I woke in the morning, I was cuddling my pillow. It was still wet from my tears. I had a ball of pain in my stomach, and I believed that I would not see Seth again, so the pain I felt was grief. I had lost my best friend, my protector, the person who had always saw beauty in me when everyone else had seen a freak, but I also knew that he was my creation, so essentially he had simply been a version of me. I'd always found it cheesy when people were dying in movies and they'd say, "I'll always live on inside you." But in this case, Seth really would live on inside me somewhere. I drove to my parents' old house that afternoon, and I wasn't surprised to find there was no house across the road from mine. I always knew. I'd just buried it down. It was just an unused, 3-story, shoddy council building. I stared at it for a while, looking through the window that I had pretended was Seth's room. And for a moment I thought I saw him, staring back at me, his face contorted in terror, screaming silently, fists banging against the window, his eyes pleading with me to release him. But I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and when I reopened them there was nothing there. It's strange, really, because just a few weeks later, my boss threw himself out of the top window of that old council building. So close to my parents' house, so close to my life. It's funny how life is full of such strange little coincidences. I was sorry he felt so disgusted by his perverted ways that he needed to end his life, but I was glad that life at work started to go back to normal, and I began to flourish again. I have my first appointment with a very good therapist soon. It's expensive, but I know it will be worth it. I won't tell them about Seth. I always like to keep him all to myself. But I'll tell them about the obsessive crushes and what my stepdad did. Unless, of course, I'm imagining the therapist, or the dream job I have that allows me to pay for it. Maybe I'm locked in an asylum somewhere. Maybe I cracked at some point and, well, maybe everything is in my mind, created by myself to protect me from the truth.